For they had not understood about the laws because their hearts were hardened. Words from the 52nd verse of the 6th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Mark. For they had not understood about the laws because their hearts were hardened. Please be seated. There are some 4 basic elements which form the nucleus of several stories in the New Testament, and one is Jesus, the second, the disciples, the third, a boat, and the fourth, a sea or stormy sea. Now, these stories, when you really think of them, seem to connect with us because there isn't anything that would better illustrate that feel of circumstances that are out of our control. The picture of a boat being tossed about aptly describes how we somehow seem to be in certain circumstances. And I want us to step back a bit to last week's story, because this week's gospel causes us to step back somewhat, and the ending of this gospel reflects on last week. For they had not understood about the laws because their hearts were hardened. Now, these words suggest that the disciples had failed to learn the important lesson from this remarkable event. Now, let's begin by considering the context of this story, so we can not only understand the principles God seeks to teach us in it, but also learn lessons that the disciples failed to learn. Jesus had just performed a wonderful miracle, and the disciples had the privilege of being deeply and personally involved in it. Now, a huge multitude of people had gathered around Jesus and sat to hear him teach. And before he was through, the disciples encouraged him to send the people away into the villages and the towns because it was getting late, we were in a deserted place, and they got to be hungry by now, and we have nothing for them to eat. So send them away to get something. And Jesus blows the whole story out of the water when he says, "You give them something to eat." This feeding miracle is an important part of our story because the crowds of people were amazed at Jesus, and according to John's Gospel, Jesus could see that they were about to take him and force him to be king on the spot. That is what was about to happen. Now, the suspicion is that even the disciples themselves were tempted by the prospect, but the problem was that people wanted a king who could feed them material things. Jesus was certainly going to be their king, or a king, but it was God's plan that he first die for our sins, and that is what he intended to fulfill. The prospect of instant kingship was in reality a diversion from God's plans for our redemption, a temptation designed by one to short-circuit Jesus' important sacrifice on the cross. And we see Jesus now sending the disciples out in a boat, the region near Bethsaida. And in fact, the original language of Mark's text, Jesus strongly urged them or compelled them to get into the boat. Jesus wasted no time in getting the disciples out of this spiritually hazardous situation. There's also the belief that he also got sought to get himself away from the situation. He remained behind to dismiss the crowd, and then, having bid them farewell, he himself departed to a lonely spot on one of the mountains that surrounded the sea, and prayed for a while to his Father, where no temptation was. And even he, in his humanity, recoiled from the agony and curse of the cross. And if this is so, just think of how much he loves us, how much he is willing, how much he is able. And that brings us to the main event of our story. It had already become late in the day by the time the disciples had gotten into the boat, and Mark tells us in verse 47 that evening came and the boat was in the middle of the sea and Jesus was alone on the land. Now, apparently, as so often happens in the Sea of Galilee, which is surrounded by tall mountains and hills, a sudden and unexpected wind struck. The disciples were trapped in a difficult situation. They rowed and rowed, strained at the oars, and yet, by the fourth watch of the night, that is somewhere in the region of 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, the disciples still had not advanced any more than 3 or 4 miles across this vast lake. They had not traveled far, but they were still far enough from the shore to be in danger. They were strong, experienced fishermen among them, but they nevertheless knew the danger they were in. They were at the mercy of a situation that was outside of their control. This is a tremendous illustration of the things we often experience. We may not find ourselves tossed around in a small boat in the midst of a storm, but we do occasionally find ourselves overwhelmed, tossed and thrown around at the mercy of circumstances outside of our control. Within our context, we have persons who were thrown into circumstances outside of their control because of a loss of job. We know of persons who go to the doctor and the result causes their life to be tossed into a situation seemingly out of their control, creating a situation that is distressing and intolerable, and there doesn't seem to be anything that they themselves can do about it. But whatever form our storm might take, there are certain things we need to pay attention to. We can rest assured that God is in perfect control of the lives of those who trust Him. We can take comfort in the fact that when such times come upon us, it's never because He has forgotten us, or because He is ignoring us, or because He has ceased to love us. In His sovereign wisdom, power, and love, He occasionally allows such things, we're told, to fall upon us. These things somehow strengthen us. They permit us, or they allow us to trust in God, to exercise the faith that we so often talk about. When we look at this story, when we look at this passage this morning, we see certain things. And the first thing is this: Jesus sees our circumstances. Have you ever experienced the sense that your circumstances were so frustratingly out of control that nothing you did made a difference? I'll tell you what I mean. You have an appointment. You get up early, but you leave home late. And everybody on the road is driving at 2. There is nowhere to go. There's no way to turn. You are now in a situation where there's nothing more you can do. While we can take responsibility for that situation, the thing is, Jesus sees us in our situation, and we're told that He saw them straining at oar, and He walked and He went to them. That is important. Because wherever we are, Jesus has that ability to come to us. The other thing is this: Jesus transcends our circumstances. He's outside of what is happening. When you think of Jesus walking on the water, we have a particular notion that comes to mind, because the boat is being tossed around with these 12 men in it, but somehow when we think of Jesus walking on the water, we don't see Jesus stumbling around. Our image is of Jesus walking, going where He has to be. When we think of it, probably we don't even see Jesus as getting wet. But there's a storm raging, but even in our thinking, Jesus is outside of this circumstance. Jesus transcends whatever it is that we are going through, because He has that ability to come into it and to show us this really is nothing, because the real thing is here. The third thing is, Jesus presents Himself to us in our circumstances. One of the things that struck me about this story is that He was going to walk past. And I'm thinking to myself, if Jesus is coming to help, why is He going to walk past? Anybody can say why He would walk past? A dramatic entry. You sure? A dramatic entry. I'm not too sure about the dramatic entry. But the thing is, for Jesus to walk past, maybe that could show that this really is nothing. Look at me. I'm out here in the midst of all of this. Why are you so afraid? That might be one. But the thing is, Jesus has that ability also to enter into our circumstance. And he comes and he dwells with the disciples, and suddenly everything is nice and calm. We need to understand Jesus does not pass us by. Because as long as we trust and believe, Jesus will come to our need, to our aid when we have need. Jesus comes into our circumstance. Are we inviting him in though? Or will we just allow him to walk by? You see, we need to invite Jesus into where we are. When he enters our circumstance, things get a lot calmer. Because no sooner than he sat in the boat, everything done. Despite whatever situation we are in, when Jesus enters that situation, there is calm. There's comfort. There's solution. We need to take the necessary parallels from this story and understand that Jesus knows where we are. He can see where we are. It is not that Jesus does not care, because he does. Jesus is more than what we are experiencing at the time. One of the things that we often get confused with is the emotional and the spiritual. We need not confuse those two things. Every day we find ourselves on this emotional roller coaster where you go from happy to sad, from contented to not contented, from one extreme to the other. That is emotional. The thing is, do our emotions define who we are? Because if you're feeling sad, are you a sad person? If you're lonely, are you a lonely person? The thing is, our spirituality should be what defines us. And at the end of the day, spiritually, we are still children of God. So despite what is going on within our own sphere, God is there. God is there bigger than the situation. God is there able to sort the situation out. We need therefore, when tossed to and fro, and those times will come, unfortunately, not to lose sight of who we are. Paul, in speaking to the church in Ephesus, makes another observation where we are tossed to and fro spiritually. That is not what we're called to. Because when we are tossed to and fro spiritually, then some funny things happen. Because the situation then becomes a lot bigger than it really is. There is nothing that will come that is bigger than God. There is nothing that we can experience that is stronger than God. There is nothing that will present itself to us that God cannot fix. We need, therefore, to trust in God. There will be times when we are rowing and nothing is happening, but God sees. There are times when we will be afraid, but God can comfort. The thing is, we need, therefore, to call upon God. Are we calling upon God, or are we contented to be where we are? Because in the example that Paul gave, some have resorted to not call upon God, but to call upon man. The priest will fix it. There are only so many things that I can fix. And honestly, the list of things that I can't fix, bigger than the list of things that I can fix. When I was a deacon, the dean at the time got to the cathedral one morning and he said to me, "People are really strange, you know." There was a lady her house was damaged in a fire. And she had the opportunity to make a call. And instead of calling the fire service, she called the priest. Because the priest can fix this. Now, he was not a fireman. In his other life, he was a teacher. But the thing is, while we trust individuals, we should never stop trusting God. I'm not going to stand here and tell you don't trust anybody. Above all, trust God. Because there are persons who present themselves to us with an agenda. When you really think about it, the only person more important than you is yourself. And when push comes to shove, often we deal with self. It is almost a reflex reaction. If you are driving and your children or your wife or your mother is sitting in the seat beside you, at the point of impact, are you going to reach out and stop that person from flying forward, or are you going to brace yourself? Automatically we brace ourselves, because I guess that is how we're constructed, to preserve self. We have to be outside of self to think of other persons. The thing is, when people present themselves to us, we need to think. Because there's still many persons who come presenting a picture of God, but behind the picture all sorts of strange things are happening. I'm not pulling down anybody or digging at any person, but I will say this: we should never give up salvation for religion. And I will leave that there. God is able to do whatever. This story shows us, if you believe in God walking on water or not, above all, it presents to us a picture of a God who is willing, a God who is always willing, and a God who is able. We therefore need to be willing to trust this God, to call upon this God. It is not about saying it, it is about doing it. Because a large part of what Christianity is about calls for us to get up and to get busy. That is the problem with Christianity. We like to talk about things, we can sing about them, but we're not necessarily willing to do them. When we take an example from Jesus Christ himself, his ministry was about doing. Ours should be as well. When you think of the things that we're called to love, to be caring, to be all of these things, those are verbs. At its very basic level, a verb is still a doing word. Let us therefore do. Amen.